right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Myths and Needs of Grieving Children with Greg Adams. My name is Chad Severs and I'll be your webinar host for today. I'm the project manager for Arkansas Building Effective Services for Trauma. What folks frequently know us as is we train child therapists around the state in trauma-focused CBT, parent-child interaction therapy, child-parent psychotherapy, and other evidence-based treatments. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to do a few housekeeping announcements and then introduce our speaker a little bit, and then we'll get started. So just a couple of announcements. If you'd like to ask a question during this presentation, we hope that you do, please use the question feature, which is on the right side of your screen. We've saved a good chunk of time at the end here to answer as many questions as we can. If you'd like to earn a CEU, just be sure to stick around to the very end. We'll have a code that's given at the end of this webinar. And if you happen to be watching with a group, just let me know who the person signed in as so I can just kind of verify attendance and that sort of thing is helpful. And also, this webinar we have, or the presentation to this webinar is actually available as a handout, so if you'd like to download that, feel free to do so. We are recording the webinar. We upload it to our website shortly after today's presentation. And if this is a topic that interests you, be sure to check out our Facebook page. We frequently post about upcoming training opportunities such as this, so that's probably where we're most active in terms of what's going on in the state. Let me introduce Greg here. Greg Adams is a social worker at Arkansas Children's Hospital, where he coordinates the Center for Good Mourning, a grief support and outreach program, and works with bereavement support staff who are exposed to suffering and loss. His past experience at Arkansas Children's includes working in pediatric oncology and pediatric palliative care. He has written for and edited the Morning News, an electronic grief loss newsletter, since its beginning in 2004. Greg is also an adjunct professor at the University of Arkansas Little Rock Graduate School of Social Work, where he teaches a grief loss elective, and students are told that while class is an elective, grief and loss are not. Greg graduated from Baylor University, majoring in social work and religion, and earned a master's in social work from the University of Missouri. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Greg, and thank you again.
All right, thank you. I'm glad to be here, and thanks everybody for their interest in joining today. Just a little bit more information about the resources we have here before we get into the other content for today. As Chad mentioned, at the Center for Good Mourning here at Arkansas Children's Hospital, we offer several things that may be of interest to you and to the people that you serve. We do grief and loss support groups for kids, pre-K through high school, in the spring and the fall every year. They're on once a week on the evenings, and they go for 8 weeks. And the kids come, and they also, the adults in the family can also come. Any adult connected to a child can come, and we typically have 25 to 30 kids register every time, and around 15 or 20 adults, and we divide those kids into 4 groups and the adults into 2 different groups. There's no charge for the program, as we're supported by our hospital auxiliary, but you do have to register, and that application can be found on our website, which is on this slide there at goodmourningcenter.org. Also at that website, we have a list of all the grief support groups we know of in the state of Arkansas, and we are continually updating that list as we get updates, and so feel free to check that out, and if you find information there that we're missing, please pass that on to us. We have in our resource section some recommended books, both for kids and for adults, and there's some articles and essays about grief and loss, some links to really good websites, and some things that you could print out or share with people that you work with about supporting grieving adults and grieving children. Part of my job is I do get a chance to go in the community and to do education and schools or groups such as this, and so I'd be glad to do that if I could be of use to you, or even just an email or a phone call to talk about a situation. And then last to mention is that we do that newsletter that Chad mentioned in the introduction that goes out 4 times a year. It's free for anybody. You can sign up on the website if you're interested in grief and loss, and you obviously are since you're on this call today. So I'd encourage you to check that out. You can see some of our past issues, and if that interests you, just go ahead and subscribe. So that's enough of the commercial part of the program. We'll move on from there. And so what we're going to do today when we're talking about children in grief, what we're not quite going to do, if you can see this cartoon, it says, before we continue, is there anyone else present who has never seen a dead person? So that's not quite what we're after today. Neither are we going to do on this next slide where it says teaching little ones about death and the family, that grandpa's in hell and we're rich now. That's not what we're going to talk about either. We're going to try to take it a different way. So as we get started, particularly since so many of the people on this call may be working with people and interested in the field of trauma, we did want to make a few comments about grief and trauma and how they connect and also how they differ. So the thought in the grief world, particularly if you think about grief in terms of death, that all deaths have grief. Not all of them are traumatic, but some of them are. And something can be traumatic and you don't have to have grief. For instance, if I was going home and I in my neighborhood and I parked my car and I saw across the street that there was somebody in the yard and it was somebody I didn't know and they had died and they had been hurt and it was a mess and a hard thing to see, I could be traumatized by that, but I wouldn't be grieving the loss of that person. But I would have trauma. If I found that that person was somebody I knew and that somebody that I really cared for, then I could be having both. I could be having grief because of the loss of them and also trauma because of what I saw and experienced. But grief and trauma can take us a couple different directions. So in grief, we often want to move toward the person or the thing that we've lost, and we yearn for that, and we wish it was back, and we want to hold on to it. In trauma, we often want to move away from that experience. That experience causes us anxiety and fear. And so somebody who is grieving someone where it was also a traumatic experience can really be caught in the middle of those two different dynamics of being pulled towards somebody, but also when that happens, being pulled toward the trauma. And we know, and this would be something that you all would know well, that part of what happens in trauma is, and also in grief, is that we numb ourselves and because it's too much to take in all at once, and that can be helpful sometimes in the short term. It can be a survival technique and help us to get through what we're doing or be able to function in the short term, but it's a high cost to do it in the long term. And that's where sometimes PTSD can come in, where we think about the past being experienced as the present. So it doesn't feel like the past, it feels like the present. And that's a real warning sign that we need to find another way to deal with something. One of the people who's done a lot of work on traumatic grief is Ted Rynearson. And one of the things that he's done and in his work, and that we have modeled our program recently, is that when they start talking about a person who's died, that instead of starting with the experience of the loss, starting with the experience of the person's life. And his perspective on that is that first we start with what hasn't changed, and so we ground ourselves in what has not changed, and that's the person that they lived. And sometimes one way to think about it is that when a person dies, that it's very important that they died, it's very important how they died, but the most important thing is that the person lived. And so we start there. And when we get a chance to talk to kids in our groups, or when I get a chance to go out and in a school situation and talk to kids or even adults, that's where we start. We start with who the person was, and we ground ourselves there. Then after we get that more settled and secure, then we talk about what happened. I also like the way that Robert Niemeyer talks about dealing with traumatic situations, where he talks about pacing, bracing, and facing, with the idea that sometimes we take these situations and we need to pace them and be very careful and thoughtful so that we take them and don't overwhelm somebody when we are bringing up memories or talking about things. So we can take it slow, we can stop, we can pause, we can take it piece by piece. And all along the way, when we support people, and sometimes we pause and give them that extra support and let them to calm themselves and ground themselves again. And we do that while we're still trying to face the things that need to be faced. So we're going to talk today really about the grief aspects rather than the trauma, but you're going to, of course, meet people where both of those are happening. And the conventional wisdom I've heard and read is that, trauma trumps grief, and that if somebody is feeling effects of trauma and grief, that oftentimes we need to help them to find a way to take care of some of those traumatic symptoms where they're not feeling as anxious or panicky or scared, so get them to a better place there so we can then focus more on the loss and the grief. One other thought before we get into the kid information specific is that there's an idea that has been out for a number of years that came from Europe with some researchers, Stroba and Schutt, and called the dual process model. And this model of thinking about grief and loss has been really helpful. As we've talked, we generally often share this with adults, and we don't share it the same way with kids, but I think it makes sense when we think about it with kids. And the idea is that whenever there's a big loss in someone's life, that there's really two things that we end up having to do. To put it real simply, is that one is we have to deal with the loss and the pain that comes with it and give that the attention and focus, but also we have to figure out how are we going to live now that the world is different, because this person or this thing that we had before that was important to us is not gone anymore. And we go back and forth between that loss orientation and that restoration orientation. And in a healthy way and in a natural way for most of us, we go back and forth. We focus some on the loss and we're dealing with that and the painful things, and then sometimes we focus on going on with our life and how we're going to live. And for kids, it's, they're going to school or how to deal with how changes in where they live or in their family. And then they're pulled back into the loss. And so we just go back and forth. And as time goes on, we can have more control about going back and forth. And we can choose to focus on the loss, and we can choose to do other things. And it's not just being helpless, being pulled back and forth. And one way to think about if somebody's making good adaptation to loss is to think about it from both of these perspectives. How are we doing? How's that person doing with the pain and the loss and those consequences? And how are they doing with finding ways to live again? And being able to do both of those. And so obviously if somebody's caught in the loss and the grief that's there and they can't function, then that's a real concern. And what happens many times, I think, too, is that people try to focus on the living again, and so they try to stay really busy and have full of activities. But if we do that and don't give the appropriate attention to the loss, then the loss will come in and demand attention. And that comes in terms of acting out behaviors for kids. It comes in terms of sleep disturbances, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, things where, bad dreams, where the loss is basically demanding and saying, no, you have to pay attention. This is important. And so we have to find ways to give it its due, and also, but not give it more than its due, and finding ways to continue to live. All right, with that said, we'll think a little bit about how kids understand death. And again, there are many kind of griefs, and any kind of loss that happens grief follows it. But we're going to think mostly about the loss of death and the grief that comes with that. And so it's easy to find, and you can Google that up and find different guidelines about how kids understand death at different ages, and those can be helpful because we know that children are not just small adults, that they experience the world and take it in differently. But one of the ways to think about it too is to think about that kids, no matter what their age, is these are the concepts that eventually they will want to understand, for them to understand what death is about. And it will differ for different children depending on their maturity level and their developmental place and their experience in life. So if a child who's had no experience with death at all may come to these differently than somebody who had a grandparent die or a pet die when they were young, and they at least had that experience about understanding some of these big concepts. So one thing that could be thought about if you're working with a child is to think about these different concepts and think about how is this particular child understanding these concepts. And I would suggest that it's just not kids who struggle with these, that it's adults too. And we'll go through them and talk a little bit about that. So one is that death is universal, and that means that everything that's alive dies. And that can be pretty disturbing when you get that realization that it's somebody close to you, that, wait a minute, that means that I'm going to die, and that my parents are going to die, and the people I'm close to are going to die. And that can be a really difficult thing, to think that it affects me too. And sometimes that awareness is raised because of a situation, or sometimes I think it's because a child just gets old enough that they're starting to be able to connect the dots on that. Death then is inevitable. We can't stop it. We can sometimes postpone it, but it's not possible to stop it. And much of the time it's unpredictable. And that's an issue that's worth thinking about for kids, because part of the disturbance of death is when it's unpredictable. And so the more we can make it predictable, the better it can be. Because the more the world is predictable and reliable, then even though it may be upsetting, that can give children a greater sense of security. And we all experience that when we have somebody who dies unexpectedly, that it can sometimes shake us in a different kind of a way than somebody whose death we have anticipated, and we knew that there was a chance for it. Another issue, by the way, there's a really nice book, we have this listed on our website, called Lifetimes, a beautiful way to explain death to children, that deals with this particular issue really nicely, and we use it at the hospital. And it talks about that everything that is alive has a beginning and an ending with living in between, and that's its lifetime. And it talks about different plants and animals and how long their lifetimes are, and then it comes around to people. But it comes back with that repeated theme that in some ways it's true for everything, that there's a beginning and an ending with living in between, and that's its lifetime. And they are beginning and ending all the time, everywhere around us. Irreversibility is another that is a difficult concept to get, that when you're dead, that you stay dead, and that can be difficult for people to get, and that can be difficult even for us as adults, because there's sometimes, if you have had somebody who has died, that you'll see somebody from a distance and that looks like them, or you hear a voice or a sound, or the phone rings, and for a split second you think it's them, even though you know in your head that they're dead, but there's part of you that doesn't quite believe it. And that can happen that way too. And that connects to the challenge for kids sometimes, if they have a religious faith, which is similar to my religious faith, where there is this belief that when you're dead, you don't stay dead, that you can live again in another life. And that's a pretty big concept. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And that can be confusing, particularly for young children. And it takes some thought to figure out how we help kids learn the faith that we want to teach them, if that's part of our family, but also how do we not confuse them and disturb them. Non-functionality is another piece. What does it mean to be dead? And when you're dead, what's that like? If that means that you don't feel things, and you don't move, and you don't talk and hear and see and get sleepy or hungry or need to go to the bathroom, that's really what it means to be dead. However, that is a hard one to get to. With adults sometimes, you'll hear people say things like, I don't want to think about Grandpa out there cold in the ground, or I want to have one of those sealed caskets, or so that he doesn't get wet. And now we know that they don't feel anything anymore, but it's really hard for us to really take that fully in. Or when sometimes families are faced with a situation where they could donate tissue or organs, and sometimes families will say, you know what, no, she's been through enough. And we understand that on some level, but on another level, there's that, well, when you're dead, we don't do that unless people have died, and when you're dead, you don't experience anything else, so you don't go through anything else, but it's hard to fully take that in. Causality can be really a tricky one too. Many people get cancer, some people die, many people don't. Every year in Arkansas or in the country, people get the flu, most people get better, some people die. There's a car accident, somebody dies, somebody else survives. So why do some people die and why don't? What actually causes death? That's a really hard one. And then the last one that they include, and I think it's appropriate it's included last, which is the idea that there's some kind of continued life form after death, and that's where many people believe, and but that is a more abstract way of thinking. So Alan Wolfelt has done a lot of work with adults and children grieving, and I want to use some of his way of framing what are some myths or misunderstandings about children and grief as we go through. One of them is that grief and mourning are the same thing, and sometimes we use those words interchangeably, but I find it helpful for both adults and for kids to think about those as being different things. And the idea is that grief is what happens to you on the inside whenever you have lost something that's important to you. And so if you lose a little bit of something, you have a little bit of grief. A big thing, you have a lot of grief. The idea there is that you don't get any choice about it. It's just the way it is. It's the feeling and the experience that you have on the inside. Mourning, on the other hand, when we think of it in this regard, is what you do on the outside. It's what you choose to do with that stuff on the inside. In some ways, it's a grief gone public. So we choose to talk about people, or to wear a piece of clothing that belonged to somebody, or to have a picture up, or to tell stories, or to have a memorial, or as people get older and they get tattoos, or they have jewelry they wear. So we do things on purpose to remember. In some ways that we do mourning helps us move toward a healthier place of living. In some ways we do mourning can not be helpful, and sometimes keeps us caught in the past. One example that sometimes we'll use with children and adults is that think about that grief is like a big hurt. And so that if I was leaving work today and somebody had a big time on the parking lot and had broken a bottle and nobody noticed it to pick it up, and I was tripped and I fell down and I fell right on this broken bottle, and I got up and I had a big old piece of glass and it stuck really deep in my hand. That's the grief part. Didn't choose it, didn't want it, but there it is, and it really hurts. So now what do I do? And this is where I get some choice, maybe the mourning part. And so sometimes when I ask kids, so what do you do? And so they'll talk about, pulling it out, or going to the doctor, or to the hospital, or getting some help. And then eventually we come up with the idea that what if we just ignored it? What if we just let it be? And I didn't want to deal with it, and I got in my car, and my hand was bleeding, and I drove home, grasped my hand, got home, gave my wife a hug, ate some supper, got on the internet, checked my email, glass still in my hand. Got the next day, I get dressed, shower, shave, glasses in my hand. I go through my day. Maybe it's my exercise day, and I do some exercises and lift some weights and do some push-ups. I got that glass in my hand. So what happens if I just leave it there? And of course, they can pick up that it's going to hurt more at worst. It's going to bleed. I could die. I could lose my hand. It's going to get in my way. I could hurt the people around me that I love. Yeah. And so it's really not a very wise thing to do, but it is one of my choices. And we know people who have a really big thing happen to them, and they don't give it the attention that it needs, and it causes trouble, and it hurts worse. The pain doesn't go away. They hurt the people around them even if they don't mean to. It makes a mess. It keeps them from doing things they want to do because it just makes it impossible. So they're not the same thing, although they're connected. Another thought that is not correct is that child's grief is short in duration, and this can come from when we think about the kids grieve more in doses, is that they take it in smaller pieces and they go on with other things, and they can lead us to think that they aren't impacted by it. But when we think about it, the question of duration of grief is really just not a very helpful question about time. So if you thought about, let's think about a 5-year-old girl perhaps, and let's say that her mother has died. So isn't she going to miss her mother differently when she's 10 and she's on the soccer team or doing a concert at her school and her mother is not there, or when she's getting ready to go to middle school and all the things that are happening around middle school, or when her body is changing and she's going through puberty, and who's going to help her navigate that, understand what's going on because her mother is not there, or when she's in high school and she gets that driver's license, or maybe she's going to the prom, or she's graduation and people are getting pictures taken, and they're getting pictures taken with their parent on either side, but her mother is not there, or she's grows up and becomes an adult and she has her own family, and she's thinking about what was it like when my mother was pregnant with me, or when I was a baby, and who she asked about that. And maybe when her child gets to be 5 and she remembers when she was 5 and her mother died, and so on and on it will go, and she will continue to be impacted by that experience, the death of her mother, which doesn't mean that she can't have a good life, but it's going to be different. And I think that at one point it's not going to matter to her anymore. It's just not a very helpful or realistic way of thinking about it. One other myth that sometimes people think about is that grief is predictable and stage-like. This can come from what many of us learned. If we learned anything about grief and loss before, we learned those 5 stages of grief, with denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. It's amazing to me when I get a chance to talk to groups how many people know those stages, and but those came from, as many of you would know, from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote a book in the late 60s called On Death and Dying, and she did us a great favor with that book because it helps us to think about and talk about death and dying in ways that we were not. And but there's been a difficult legacy with that book, because we've taken her 5 observations of people who were dying, which is where she got those what are sometimes called stages, and we've applied those to all kinds of situations, for people after death, for kids, and we found in the research that those stages really are not universal. We know that in many ways already, because people will say, well, not everybody has all those stages, and sometimes you go back and forth and it's different. So at some point it's like, well, how are these really helpful to us? And one of the ways that they're not helpful is it suggests that people have a universal experience, and also that grief is stage-like, that you go from one point to the next, and it's like going from 7th grade to 8th grade to 9th grade, and that you leave something behind and you don't go back again. But it doesn't take for long for us to think about it, that we know that grief is much messier than that. And we can have all kinds of feelings, and they can go back and forth, and we can have contradictory feelings at the same time. What we sometimes do with older kids in our grief support groups is we'll make a brainstorm list up on a board or on a poster sheet about different ways people feel when someone dies, and we end up with 20 to 30 different words, and those words are all kinds of things, from sadness and anger, which is really a pretty common thing, particularly for kids to feel. That anger can be as strong as sadness, or even stronger than sadness. And people feel anxious and worried and fearful and helpless and hopeless, and sometimes relieved, but they don't want to say that because they feel bad about that. They feel guilty about that and other kind of things. They can feel depressed and suicidal and tired and apathetic and all kinds of different ways. And so it's much messier than any 3 or 4 or 5 stages. And does everybody feel all those ways? No. But can you feel more at the same time? Yes. And so grief really can be a mess. And it can be different for each person and different for each loss. It's not going to be the same each time. When we think about it too for kids, sometimes people think about infants or toddlers, and we know they don't really understand, so it doesn't affect them. And we're learning more and more, as you would know, about infancy and young adulthood, and we know that it does make a difference. And that the idea is that if you're young enough to bond, then you're young enough to feel the loss of that which you were bonded to, and to have a feelings and impact on that. It doesn't always mean that you understand it, what's happening to you, or have words for it, but it doesn't mean that you're not impacted. So one way we think about this is you could think about a toddler perhaps, and maybe they're about 3 or 4 years old, and they were learning right at that place where they were learning the potty train. And if they had their father died and they were close to their dad, they might have sleep disturbances. They might not eat as well. They might be clingy. They might not be nervous about new situations. They might be looking around for him, expecting him to come back. They may be more irritable and more moody and have a harder time learning things. They might regress them and go back to an earlier stage, which was more secure and safer, and maybe lose some of that progress they made in their potty training. The thing is that all those things we could see with that toddler, we could also see with adults, and that a person could feel more clingy to the things that they know. They could want that security of going back and being younger and having people take care of them. They could have sleep and appetite disturbances. Their moods could be much more volatile. They could have that yearning and looking for someone and waiting for them to come back. One of the biggest differences for kids and adults is that kids don't have as much ability, the younger they are, of being able to connect the dots and saying, I am experiencing this, I'm feeling this because this happened. We wouldn't expect that 3-year-old to come home from preschool and say, Mom, I got in trouble today, I spilled my milk, I bit this kid, they put me in timeout. I think it's because of Dad. I'm missing him. I think I'm just not myself anymore. We wouldn't expect that. But we as adults could say that. When Father's Day rolls around, or a birthday comes around, or holidays, we could understand that it's affecting us. And so part of the way we help children is we help them connect the dots. We give them ways and places to take those feelings and that inside experience and put it into memory and memory objects and storytelling and scrapbooks and sharing things with other people, so that they have a place to go with this and they can more connect those dots in a way that could be helpful to them. We do know that kids get impacted by what they see with adults. As a fellow colleague of mine in the children's grief world likes to say, that children are great observers, but they're not always of adults, but they're not great interpreters of what they observe. And I think that is really true, that how we see adults doing makes a difference for us. And so sometimes what we'll counsel adults to say is, when they tell kids about a death, is to say, you're going to see me and the people around you, everybody is really upset that this happened and very sad. And so sometimes we're going to look upset and we're going to be sad because this is really upsetting and sad for us. But we are still going to take care of the things we need to do. We're still going to do things here at the house and take care of you, even when we're sad and upset. To let them know that it's okay, because they're going to see that things are different. And if we let them know, we acknowledge that it's not that crazy making where people pretend like things are fine when they're really not fine. And we can also model that it's okay to feel those kind of ways and still do what we need to do. In some ways, what we want the children to know is the basics, that somebody died, and at the level they can understand that, and what it means to be dead, and that it's very upsetting, and we can talk about it anytime, and that the people around them are going to be like that, but we'll take care of them. And if it's not their fault, then it's not their fault. And so that they can understand as best they can, because what we tell kids always should be the truth. It's not always the full truth, because they may not be able to take it in and comprehend it, but it needs to be true, so that we don't have to come back later and say, you know, I told you this, but the reality, the truth is something else. But we can say, I told you this, and now I can tell you some more. So it's not true that childhood loss leads to a maladjusted life. Most of us have had a loss in their childhood, and one study, about 1 in 20 kids has the death of a parent by the time they finish high school. And so we know it happens a lot. Most kids have grandparents or relatives who die. Many of them have other deaths closer to home. And we can certainly live well, but it will impact us. So a few more minutes before we talk a little bit about some things that kids do need. If you work with kids very long, then you're going to get a question about attending funerals and whether or not they should go. And I think if that question comes, one way to think about it is to ask the adult who's asking that question about what are their concerns about a child attending funerals, because parents and adults have real concerns. Oftentimes they don't want to make things worse. They don't want to make things more traumatic than they are. They don't want to confuse a child. Sometimes they don't want the child to be exposed to the adults being very emotional. All those are fair concerns, but would suggest that those are not big enough concerns to restrict children from having a choice. Because the idea is that the reason that we have funerals at all and memorials, and I'm a big supporter of that, I think they do a lot for us. They bring people together who feel similarly. They help us recognize that something really important happened. They help us to look back at how things were, and also to look forward at how things are going to be. You know, whenever we have any big changes in our lives, we often do have some kind of a ritual, whether it's a baby shower or a wedding or a graduation or a retirement dinner or a welcome breakfast. You know, we have these times where we bring people together so we can experience this together and get support from each other. And sometimes we also bring in the way we look at the world and our religious traditions, so we can again look for both comfort and understanding about what it is that we've experienced. Kids can benefit from all of that too. They don't have to understand all of it. It also gives a safe place sometimes to be emotional, like this is a place where it's all right. So the general idea is for kids is that they need information about what's going to happen, and then they need choice about what they want to participate in and support. You could certainly imagine that if a parent has had their fellow parent die, and that parent may need a backup for that child at the memorial service or the funeral, so that if that child needs to step out, that somebody can do that without that parent having to do that, because they may need to stay. But there's a lot of different choices. We can have a private viewing. We can have, if there's going to be a body, the body often is a concern, but kids can be prepared to where that doesn't have to be a traumatic thing either. But we have to be very careful about how we explain what they're going to see and what it means and not see. But there's private things, there are public things, there are burials, there are other pieces, but all along the way, just like if a child was going to a brand new school or going to the dentist for the first time, we would give them information and prepare them for what they're going to experience. Sometimes we think about the expression of tears as something we want to avoid. Years ago, I was exposed to a children's grief program called Drying Their Tears. I thought it had great information in it, but I really didn't like that title, because the purpose is not to drive people's tears away. Oftentimes the purpose of what we're doing is giving space where tears can come and letting people not be alone in their tears. And so our goal is not to take that away, but is to give people security and safety to feel what there is to feel. Because grieving kids and adults need really two different permissions. They need permission to feel as bad as they feel, and we try to discourage people from that. And they also need permission that they can experience for themselves to feel better and find ways to live again and enjoy things. The issue of religion is a delicate one, because we want to be very respectful to people in the religious faith, and yet it's not uncommon that over the years here in my work that I've had a call from a parent and typically a mother, and she will talk about her preschooler, maybe a 3 or 4 year old, and talk about that the person who died, that it seems like the child is really having a hard time with that and having a hard time understanding it. And I'll ask about, so how did you explain that to the child? And sometimes they'll say things like, well, I told her that, you know, he went to heaven, or that he went to be with Jesus, or that Jesus took him, or God took him. And they have never used the word dead or died. And so the child, as we've talked it out, hasn't had an opportunity to understand that the person died and what it means to be dead. And so why aren't they coming back? Or why does person leave and hasn't come back? Or why can't we go see them where they are? And so the idea is that we need to be real careful and not to try to teach them everything about what we may believe in a religious faith when they're young and can't take it in. Just like another taboo in our society is sexuality, and we don't have to teach kids everything about sex and about contraception and birth control and STDs. You know, when they find out about their body parts, we can teach them about their body parts and then have more conversation later as they get older and can understand the rest. Then the last misunderstanding is that the goal is to help people get over it. Get over it is really one of those terms that doesn't help very much because it distorts what we're trying to do. There's a different way, other ways to think about it, but get over it is not a helpful way. Really what we're trying to do is trying to help them to live with it. And the term that Wolfelt uses is the idea of reconciliation, and I like that term. Other people talk about accommodation, but whatever word we use, it's that idea that this is a reality and we're going to have to live with it. We can't live like it didn't exist or like it never happened. How are we going to take this experience with us? And that term of reconciliation is that for a while in the beginning we're at war or in conflict with this reality. We don't even want to we don't want to deal with it because we don't even want to believe it happened. But eventually, if we're going to make progress in living with it, we make some peace with it. And we have to draw a truce and say, how am I going to live with this? So one of the things that we do with kids is that we help them to deal with the pain, experience the painful stuff, sometimes even move toward it, but they have to be supported to do that. And so we provide them the kind of support they have that they need so that they can feel what there is to feel and think about those things that they're going to miss and things that are going to be different about that person and about their life. They need a chance to experience and really express the reality of what's happened to them, which means they need good information about what happens to them. And that's a place to start often, is what information a child has been given. Because sometimes they aren't given information, which means they may be making it up or getting bits and pieces and filling in the holes in ways that aren't right or are not fair to themselves or other people. So sometimes people want that answer so bad that they'll take a bad answer, they'll make up a bad answer, like maybe it was me. So it's not just kids who do that. There's that idea about magical thinking, we know, where something happens in the world and that magical thinking is, well, maybe it was me, maybe I caused it. But I've wondered sometimes about, so when do we outgrow that? Because many of us as adults wonder that too. Well, I had planned to take that picnic and it rained, as if my picnic plans had to do with the weather. And other things happen where we think it's about us and that we have a lot more effect on things, but that's that part of magical thinking. So kids, we need to understand what it is that they do control and what it is they don't, and helping them to not take the bad answer. And sometimes that means living, without an answer too, because we may not know why something happened. One of the biggest things that we help kids with is we help them convert this relationship to one of memory. So it used to be one of physical interactive presence, where that person was around and we talked to them and saw them, but now it's one where the person is not there. So we still have a relationship with the person, but it's more through memories. There may be a place, or if they're old enough, where they can think about talking to that person or communicating to the person who's in a different place, and that can certainly be a helpful and comforting thing. But much of how we're connecting to them is in remembering how things were before. And I think that adults model that sometimes when they say things like, oh, I was thinking about your dad today and remembering how he did it in the summer and we went to the lake. Or I was thinking about your grandma and the kind of meal we had when we were at her house for Thanksgiving. And then we're just giving those examples of how we can talk about somebody, and it doesn't have to be big and huge and upsetting, but how we remember someone and they become a part of our life in a helpful way. And the painful, when we think about them, the pain part can move toward the backstage, and the comforting parts where we're grateful that they were a part of our lives and we remember them can take more front stage. Part of what kids have to do is to figure out who they are now that if there's somebody important to them who's died. If it was a brother or sister who died and somebody asked them how many brothers and sisters they have, how are they going to answer that question? Are they the oldest one now or the youngest one now if things have changed? And if somebody asks them about their dad and what he does for a living, or their mom, what she does for a living, or what are they going to do, or who's my best friend now that my best friend has died? And so those are challenging things to do. And kids have to figure out who they are in the midst of that. And just as much as adults have to make meaning of what happens to them, kids also make meaning of it and have to put their experiences into a story. So much of what we do in our grief support groups is coming at giving invitations for kids to tell their stories in different ways, whether it's by doing art projects or talking about memory books and what somebody was like and what it was like when they died, what happened at the funeral, and how holidays used to be and how they are now. All these ways we're coming out to this experience in different ways so that they're getting a chance to tell their story. And that's why kids need to know the facts of what happened so they can have a chance to come to grips with that story. Then the last need that Wolfeld would talk about is to have really support all the way through as a child is growing up. And kids will have different questions as they get older, and it'll hit them in different ways. And it doesn't mean that the parent has failed when they were younger. It may just mean that the child's at a different place, and the absence of whoever it was that they're missing, hits them in a particular way now that we couldn't have prevented in what we did before. Just a couple more slides, then we're going to open up for questions. This is just a different way of thinking about how we help kids. We look at them and helping them have as full an understanding as they can for their age and development. We give them space and support for the grieving that they will experience. Give them support and ways to commemorate and remember, and then we support them as they move on. Schools do this all the time when they have a grieving child, and they're trying to balance that loss and that restoration piece. How do we respect that this child has special challenges and is not going to be able to do everything exactly as they did before? But how do we also help them to continue on with school? Because that actually is a therapeutic thing, is to have routine and to have things that have not changed and that will be the same for them. And so there's a balance to that. And in the beginning, there may be more balance to the pain and less to the routine. But that routine is not, whether it's at home and the structure of bedtimes and where we live, those things can really be helpful in the adjustment process as they recognize that some things have changed, but not everything has changed. And then this is our last slide, and we'll have any questions. I really love this quote that I think is a guide for however we deal with kids, that there's really no magic ways to say the right words at all times, but it's the trying and the sharing and the caring, the willingness to help and the wanting to help and the willingness to listen that says, I care about you. And when we do know we care about each other, then we can talk about even the most difficult things and cope with even the most difficult times. And so I'm going to stop there. I really appreciate y'all's interest and would welcome your contact in the future if you need to reach us here at the hospital, but be open to any questions or comments that we have at the time remaining.
All right, thank you, Greg. So yeah, if folks want to type in their questions using the question feature, we'll try to get those answered. And so one of the questions that came through during the presentation, Greg, was what are the kind of red flags that you've seen in your grief work where you think, okay, now this is maybe a little bit more serious, I need to change my focus? Are there some typical red flags that you've noticed when you're working with families?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, one way to think about grieving kids and adults, and as far as our concerns, could be two different ways. One is, are they in a hole that is so deep that they can't function, and they can't get out of it? And obviously an extreme would be if they're having signs of suicidal thoughts and feelings. But if they're not able to function at all, or in a way that going to school, or doing the normal things that they did before, their own baseline, which is what we'll be comparing to, then that certainly is a huge concern. But what I think we probably see more often is a concern about, are they making progress and steps toward finding a healthy balance and a way to live again? Where sometimes people can be stuck, not in the hole, but maybe more like, if we think about it, in the rut or in the ditch, where they're functioning, but they're functioning in a really low level. So we'd be looking at, can somebody, talk about the situation, even if they don't talk about it a lot? Can they tolerate and participate in a conversation of remembering? Do they have hopefully a realistic understanding about what happened? Because if they didn't, if they were blaming themselves or other people in an unfair way, that would certainly be a concern. And are they making steps toward where they can live more fully in the present while not forgetting the past? And so what we're looking for is, because people do things differently, but is it taking them to the place where they can live more fully in the present and be open to new things without forgetting the past? And if they're doing that, then that's what we want. And it can take different forms, but I think it's a real practical perspective of that idea of, is it helping them to live well today while not ignoring what happened?
Thanks. So we've got a number of questions that have come in, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. What about dealing with multiple deaths at one time, such as with an accident or tornado?
That's a great question too. Yeah. I think that I think we would really be guided by the child to find out what things were affecting them the most, and what places that they feel like would make sense for them to start. Again, if there may be the traumatic pieces, and making sure that they are feeling as secure as they need to, that we can help them with before going into the loss part about what do you miss about the person. If they're having trouble because of anxiety, it's really hard then to think about, what was your dad like when they're having a hard time sitting still or sleeping at night. So I think that we would want to, follow their lead and try to talk with them well enough to find out about what are the things that they miss and what are the things that worry them the most, and then be guided by their input.
Another question is, if the child has a parent who has a major illness, do you discourage the parent from preparing the child to deal with the death and to focus on presently that the parent is still alive? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And the idea, I think, is that we would want to help children to understand what's happening to them and to their parent. For instance, their parent had a serious illness, so that they could actually focus on living as well as they could and not leaving them by themselves. What can happen is sometimes is that kids, if they're not told what's happening, a couple worrisome things can happen. One is that they can see that things are happening around them, and they worry about what could happen. They may worry, is their mom going to get better? Is my mom going to die? But they may not feel comfortable to bring up those questions, because the adult hasn't given them the support and the message that that's an okay thing to talk about. And so then we might be leaving that child to deal with that all by themselves instead of being able to help them. The other thing is that if death comes and they didn't anticipate it at all, it can be more disturbing and harder to deal with than if they had some preparation. And so what we would suggest is, by giving kids, again, information that they can understand, and letting somebody know that somebody is very sick, and this is what we understand about it. And if we think that they're going to get better, we can certainly tell them that we think that. If it's a question, we could tell them that we don't know if they're going to, if the doctors and the treatments are going to help, but we're going to hope so. And we can keep that door open for more conversation and check in with them at times about what their thoughts are. And then if it comes to where we think that their death is going to happen, we've laid that groundwork, and we can have that conversation that we think, we don't have anything that's going to keep this person, that's going to be able to cure them or keep them from dying eventually. So we're going to hope that they live as long as they can, and we're going to focus on trying to have as much good time as we can with them. Those are really hard conversations to have, and sometimes parents need help with that. And there's a nice booklet out there called Preparing the Children, which we recommend to people sometimes that can help with that. But it can be better for the kids in the long run, because they need support during that illness time, and they also need to help preparing so that the life doesn't feel as unpredictable and scary when things come out of the blue.
Thanks. I'm going to advance it to our next slide here and just talk about the CEU information, then we'll answer probably 2 more questions. But the code is displayed on the screen there, so if you're interested in receiving a CEU, be sure just to email me the code GRIEF. And it's helpful if you tell me your first and last name. Just makes it easier for me to look up your attendance. If you happen to be watching this at a later date, we only award CEs for attending live webinars. So we'll just kind of leave this up here. And just 2 more questions before we end today. What are some ways you would prepare a child for a funeral, more specifically viewing a body? Actually, a couple questions about that. If there's any resources or anything. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think that for many adults, that's really one of their biggest worries is the body. So it would depend, of course, on the child if they've had experiences before with some, with a person or an animal who has been dead, and what they've seen about that. And we would want, if they've never seen a body, we would want to tell them that they're going to be in a box. We would make it a way that they can understand it, whatever language they are, that they're going to be lying, and they're going to be, and they might look like they're asleep, but they're not asleep. We want to be really careful that we don't compare being dead to being asleep, but it would make sense for a child to look at a body in a casket and think that, because they look like they're in a bed. And sometimes kids also wonder about, because they only see part of the body, is the rest of the body there? And we can assure them that the whole body is there. And if you have a sensitive funeral director, they'll even open up the casket so we can see that whole body. If I would think that if that child is anxious, that's maybe a time where we could have a private viewing, so that they could ask those questions, and if they get upset or need to step out for a while, it's not a big deal, and they don't have to be embarrassed around other people. We can also sometimes tell them that, if they see that body, that that because that person is dead, they can't hear us, they don't feel anything, and that some people even touch them, and we can show them that we can touch them, but they don't feel the same because they feel cool, and so they can experience that. And it really can be helpful for a child to experience the presence of a dead body, to understand what being dead means. And it doesn't have to be traumatic for them if we prepare them and if we give them choices about what they want to do. We had a girl years ago who had a bad experience at her mother's funeral because she wasn't prepared that when she went to the funeral that the expectation was that she'd go up and kiss her mother in the casket. She wasn't told that. She wasn't given a choice. It was ended up being a really hard experience for her, and because she wasn't prepared and she wasn't given the choice. But we've seen that when kids are prepared for it, it can really help them to understand that somebody really is dead because they've experienced a body that no longer responds. There are some nice books out there that, like a book like When Dinosaurs Dies, and it's a good book to talk about. Understanding some of those basic concepts of death too, and there's some other ones too.
Thank you.
That we have on our website.
Thanks. And the code again, if you'd like a CE, the code is GRIEF, and you can send that to my email. And just one last question. What recommendations do you give parents regarding expressing their own feelings around the child, to openly express their grief in front of the children or not?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question too. To me, it's a balanced thing. I think that when parents can give their kids the heads up and the information that they're going to look sad and it's going to be sad sometimes, and may have some tears or cry, and that can help. That way they don't have to try to hide that and be ashamed of that. That gives a good message to the kids too, that it is okay. If we tell them it's okay to have emotion, then we're modeling that for them. And so I think that if we give them that heads up and let them see that can be helpful. On the other hand, the other balance is, I think if an adult has really intense feelings, where they are crying perhaps in a very intense way, I think that for their own respect and all, that often is helpful to have their own space for that. And even if then they would feel better about that, and so they don't have to be concerned, because at that point they're not able to care for their child if they're in that kind of a place. So I think that to give some space, where parents can have those feelings too, and model that, and let kids know that it's okay to have these kind of feelings, and that we can do this together. We don't have to do it all by ourselves.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for a very informative webinar. I will leave the presentation up for 30 seconds or so, and just a reminder that this is available as a handout. So if you want to go ahead and download that, it's got information on the resources and Greg's website that he mentioned at the top of the hour. So thank you again, Greg, for everything.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, everyone, have a great day. We'll hopefully see you or talk to you next month.